Hey loves, Tony here from TL Yarn Crafts, and today I'm answering 15 of your questions about crochet temperature blankets. I'm personally a big fan of temperature blankets, but every time I bring this topic up, I feel like there end up being a lot of questions, especially from people who are just planning their projects. When it comes down to it, crochet temperature blankets can be a great way to kind of chronicle your year in yarn, but they can also be kind of overwhelming, kind of stressful, and you might have a ton of questions about how to even get started. So I'm here to tell you, with a little bit of planning, you can totally crush it at your temperature blanket. I spent a lot of time planning mine, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. As I was wrapping up my temperature blanket project, I decided to ask my Instagram and Facebook communities what questions they have about temperature blankets. I got over 200 responses, but I kind of boiled them down into 15 questions. My hope is that after watching this video, you'll feel a little bit more confident in starting your very own temperature blanket. Now, if you don't know what the heck I'm talking about, I would suggest starting with this video, which is how to crochet a temperature blanket. Now, let's get into your questions. First question is always, does it have to be this year? And the answer is absolutely not. You can celebrate anything in your temperature blanket. I've seen people start with the first year that they moved into their new home, or maybe it's the year of a child's birth. Maybe it's the first year of somebody's wedding to give them a nice marriage present. Understand that temperature blankets are a concept, and you can change any aspect of it as you want to. I like to do mine from January to December because that's my personal preference, but you can literally do your temperature blanket for any period. Maybe it's this current year, maybe it was last year, maybe it was 10 years ago. It can be whatever you want it to be. Another question that I get a lot is which yarn to use. And there's a lot that goes into this decision. It could be the price, it could be the yarn weight, it could even be yarn exclusivity. Temperature blankets are really, really big, so you want to focus on keeping the price down. You want to go with a yarn line that has a wide range of colors, and you also want to go with yarns that you can get more of down the line. I re-upped on yarn 3 times throughout the year, so it was important that I picked a yarn in January that I knew I was going to be able to get more of in December. I would suggest picking a yarn that's either a DK weight or a worsted weight, and most big brands have a yarn in that weight with a wide range of colors. For example, Lion brand has Basic Stitch, Yarnspirations has Red Heart with Love, or Karen Simply Soft. The key here is to look for a value yarn that is at a reasonable price point even when it's not on sale. I decided to go with Knit Picks Swish DK. This is a 100% superwash DK weight yarn that's available in 39 different colors. Now, this is on the pricier side, but I really did appreciate the color selection and the reliability of a company like Knit Picks. Question number 3 is, how much yarn am I going to use? While it's an understandable question, it's not a great question to ask at the beginning because so many factors go into it, like the size of your blanket, the stitch that you use, and how many rows you're doing per day. But if your OCD just won't let you start a project without knowing exactly how much yarn you're going to use, I would suggest finding a blanket with a similar stitch pattern and a similar yarn weight to what you have planned. See how much yarn is used in that project, and then you'll have kind of a good guesstimate of how much yarn you're going to use. Question number 4 is what colors to use. And this is one of my favorite questions because I just love using color. Now, when it comes to temperature blankets, the default is a rainbow, going from red, maybe for your hottest colors, all the way down to purple for your cooler colors. But that's really just one option, and I think it is insanely important to pick a color palette that you truly love so you'll be able to stick with this project from beginning to end. So if you like a primary color rainbow, go for it. But how about a pastel rainbow, or maybe even a neon rainbow, or just scrap the rainbow altogether and pick a whole bunch of colors that you like? Sky is the limit. Now, if you just need some direction, I would encourage you to go on Pinterest or search Google for a pretty picture that you like, upload that into a color palette generator, pull out maybe 7, 8, 9 colors that you like, and use that as a jumping off point for picking colors for your temperature blanket. Question number 5 is how many colors to use. Now, you've got a lot of wiggle room here, but I feel like right between 7 and 9 colors is going to be a good range. Too many colors and it's going to start feeling a little bit overwhelming and you might not stick to it. Too few colors and you're going to get a whole lot of color blocking. If that's what you're going for, go for it. But I feel like that random look of a temperature blanket is a lot of what we like. Question number 6 is how much of each color to buy at the beginning of the year. A good rule of thumb is to get about 200 grams of each color at the beginning of the year. You're going to use more of certain colors over others as you're working on your project, but it's likely that you're going going to use at least 200 grams of each color over the course of the year. As the year goes on and you start to run out of colors, I'd encourage you to buy more in 200-gram increments just to make sure you have plenty on hand. Question number 7 is how to make a temperature gauge, and this is the question that I honestly get most often. So instead of trying to memorize it, I'm just going to read the note that I put on this question because it's actually really good verbatim. Your entire blanket is based off of the temperature gauge that you create, which is the thermometer that assigns a certain color to a specific range of degrees. A good jumping off point is to Google the average high and low temperature for your city over the course of a year. Those are going to be your high and low temps for your gauge. Separate the temperatures into groups. I'd suggest no more than 9 degrees in each group. For me in the Midwest, 6 to 7 degrees per group is perfect. Then assign a color to each group. You can keep these as a gradient of colors from coolest to warmest if you want, or you can mix things up a little bit. It is totally up to you. Just make sure when you're working on your temperature gauge that you write it down somewhere and have it accessible. I personally wrote it down in my design notebook, but I also took a photo of it and saved it in my favorites in my phone. So if I was working on my project away from my notebook, I could still have all the information I need to get caught up. Question number 8 is, what is the best pattern to use for your temperature blanket? If you want to take the guesswork out of your temperature blanket, there are literally dozens of patterns that exist already for how to make a crochet temperature blanket. They use everything from basic stitches to chevrons to corner, even Tunisian crochet. Honestly, you can do whatever. And if a blanket isn't your speed, there are also patterns out there to make a temperature scarf, a temperature shawl, a temperature bag, even a temperature snake. Just log on to Ravelry or even to Pinterest and search the word temperature blanket or just the word temperature, and you're going to come up with some patterns. Now, you can be like me, make your life hard, plan your own temperature blanket. There is a way to do it, but it's going to take a lot more effort up front. I would encourage starting with a gauge swatch in your selected yarn, hook, and stitch pattern. Then you'll need to do a whole bunch of math to figure out how many stitches and how many rows you need to make to get to your selected size. 365 rows of literally anything is going to be gigantic. So you can consider doing it in panels, doing 2 separate blankets, or even just doing a certain number of stitches per day as opposed to a certain number of rows. Now it's going to take some planning on the front end, but I couldn't be happier with the blanket that I designed myself. So if you have a vision for your temperature blanket, just put in the work now, so as you work on it throughout the year, you can kind of see your vision come to fruition. Question number 9 is what size to make your temperature blanket. And ultimately, I think that depends on how you're planning to use it. I decided to make mine a throw size because I find that I use handmade blankets more when I'm chilling on the couch or maybe up in my studio, as opposed to actually using them on a bed. Either way, I would suggest keeping to kind of a standard sized blanket when you're making yours. So anywhere from a throw size all the way up to a California King. Those measurements are going to be available online after a quick Pinterest search. Question number 10, are you pulling temperature from the highs, the lows, or the averages? Again, I think this is super personal and completely up to you. I've seen every iteration of temperatures in people's blankets. I personally use the averages, and I think next year I might end up using the highs to give myself a little bit more of a range in my colors. You can use the highs, the lows, the averages. You can use highs and lows in the same blanket. I've even seen some people add in different changes for precipitation like rain and snow. Again, this is a decision that you'll want to make at the front end of your project just to be consistent, but you can do whatever you want. Question number 11 is, what is the best way to store your project? I think this is something you should figure out in the beginning to save yourself some grief later on. Your temperature blanket is going to grow very big very quickly. So I would suggest designating a bag or a bin to keep it in throughout the life of the project. I would also suggest designating a crochet hook for it, because you don't want to keep kind of swapping it out and then when you're finally ready to sit down and work on your temperature blanket, you can't find your hook. So just have one that you're going to keep with that project all year. When it came to the yarn with my temperature blanket, I kept it in this basket. I designated this basket to my temperature blanket all year long, so it stayed right in here. I still have the extras in here. It just lives here now. And I had a hook hook that I designated to my project, and that's the only thing that I used it for. When it came to extra yarn, I just kept that in a bin in my closet, so I knew where it was when I needed to add more to my basket. Question number 12 is, how often do you work on your project? So when it comes to my business, I have a lot of tasks. I also have a lot of works in progress, and I handled my temperature blanket the same way I handle my business. I batch my work. That means that I get a collection of work and I save it for a certain designated time, and then I just knock it out. My batch day for my temperature blanket was Sunday afternoons, and that means that I designated time on Sunday afternoon to complete the entire week of temperatures that I had saved up in my notebook. When I set aside time to do my full week of temperatures, it would usually take me about 2 hours, and I knew that would be feasible for me throughout the year. So if you don't have time available on the weekends, maybe you work nights or weekends, or you have like flex schedules, whatever it happens to be, try and find a certain period of time every week, every 2 weeks, or even once a month to just sit down and crank out those rows or squares. Question 13 is, where can I find historical weather data? So let's say, for example, you're batching your work like me, so you need to get temperatures for the whole last week, or maybe you're working on a temperature blanket for another time period and you need to get a whole year's worth of temperatures for like 1996. I like to use a website called weatherunderground.com. This website has historical weather data for just about every city, at least in the United States. I'm not sure if it's available international, but it's going to give you the highs, the lows, the averages, and the precipitation for whichever region you put in. Question 14 is, what do I do if I fall behind on my temperature blanket? This is going to happen. I am 100% certain that at some point throughout the year, you are going to miss a Sunday of your batch work. You're going to get a couple months behind. Maybe you're going to be traveling, whatever it happens to be, and you're not going to be on schedule for your temperature blanket. The very first step to getting caught up is to not panic. Understand that your temperature blanket is going to be there whenever you get back to it. So you can kind of put it on pause, put it to the side until you have some free time. And your next step is just going to be to plan that time. Decide if you have maybe a day or two to just sit down and work on it. Or maybe you're going to split up the time that you're behind over the course of the next several weeks. Whatever it is completely up to you. And I promise you, your temperature blanket is not going to be mad if you put it away for a little while. So just don't stress. This is supposed to be a fun project that you spend free time on. So just get to it when you get to it. And question number 15 is, how do you stay motivated to finish your temperature blanket? Now, as makers, we each have our own triggers that make us not want to finish a project. Maybe it's the yarn that you're using. You really just don't love it. Maybe it's the hook and it hurts your hand, or you're not getting the range of motion that you need. Maybe it's even the size. Maybe you went for a large size blanket when you should have went for something smaller. I would encourage you to do what you can in the beginning planning phases to work out a blanket that you're going to truly love making 3, 6, even 12 months from now. I personally was really intentional about my color palette, about my stitches, even about the hook that I used when I was planning my project to make sure that I had something that I truly loved and would want to work on throughout the year. Taking that time up front, make sure that I've got a project that's manageable and it never feels like a chore. From the planning phase to execution all the way to finishing, your temperature blanket should be a project that you love. Take some time up front to figure out all the elements and then jump right in. So tell me, are you excited to start your temperature blanket? Or maybe you even have more questions. Either way, drop down in the comments and let me know. I personally am so excited for my 2020 temperature blanket. I'll be sharing my progress using the hashtag CrochetTempBlanket2020, and I invite you to use it as well. And you can also share your progress in the TLYC Makers Facebook group. Thanks so much for watching. Please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.